Pilots pass out mid-flight, and a 13-year-old boy takes control to save everyone. Before the story begins, comment below which city you're watching the video from. We love getting to know our viewers. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more exciting stories. Enjoy the story and see you soon. Jake Turner, 13 years old, was already known in his family as the Airplane Kid. Sitting at the boarding gate of Denver International Airport, he held his tablet displaying a map of the flight route. Beside him were his Aunt Susan and his cousin Ethan, 9, who couldn't stop running back and forth. "Jake, don't you ever take your eyes off that thing?" Ethan asked, leaning in to look at the screen. "I want to know everything about our plane. It's a Boeing 737-800, Jake replied without glancing up. Ethan rolled his eyes, but Jake was too engrossed to notice. As soon as boarding was announced, Jake, eager, practically jumped out of his seat and headed to the line. Once on the plane, he quickly recognized the sounds of the panel powering up and carefully observed the flight attendants organizing the passengers. As they sat down, Jake explained to Ethan how the plane would take off. "The lights will blink, and you'll hear the engines get louder. Totally normal," Jake said. Shortly after, the plane took off smoothly. Jake gazed out the window, fascinated, while Ethan enjoyed the in-flight entertainment. During the flight, a flight attendant named Andrew approached Jake, having noticed the boy's keen interest in aviation. "You seem to know a lot about this. Do you like planes?" Andrew asked. "I do. I know quite a bit about the 737-800 systems. It's my hobby," Jake replied. Impressed, Andrew continued the conversation for a few minutes, listening as Jake talked about flight routes, flap control, and even cruising speed. Ethan rolled his eyes, but Susan smiled as she overheard the conversation. While everything seemed calm, Jake noticed thick clouds on the horizon. He knew they could indicate weather issues, but decided not to mention it to avoid alarming anyone. However, the situation began to change rapidly. The first turbulence was light, but enough to catch Jake's attention. He noticed the flight attendants moving with more urgency, exchanging glances that suggested concern. Soon after, a stronger jolt shook the plane. Always observant, Jake noticed the flight attendants starting to communicate with the cockpit. Something seemed off. He tried to catch what they were saying, but he couldn't make out the words. Suddenly, Ethan, who was sitting next to Jake, mentioned something strange. "When I went to the bathroom earlier, I saw the pilots switching oxygen masks. I thought it smelled weird in there." Jake froze. Oxygen masks? A strange smell. He knew enough to realize this wasn't a good sign. Before he could say anything, the turbulence worsened, and the fastened seatbelt lights came on with full intensity. Jake looked toward the front of the plane, a growing sense that this would not be an ordinary flight. The Boeing 737-800 soared over the Gulf of Mexico as the turbulence intensified. Dark clouds had swallowed the plane, and raindrops began pelting the windows like stones. Jake Turner, seated near the wing, watched the navigation lights flickering irregularly as the wind buffeted the aircraft. Ethan, beside him, glanced nervously at his cousin. "This is normal, right?" he asked, trying to sound calm. Jake hesitated. He knew turbulence was common, but this was beginning to feel different. "We're still okay," he replied, trying to reassure him. Captain Roberts' voice came over the intercom. "Passengers, we're encountering an area of instability. Please keep your seatbelts fastened." But the captain's voice was tense, and Jake could tell something wasn't right. With every jolt, the flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, trying to maintain an air of calm. The chief flight attendant, Megan Carter, moved briskly down the aisle, securing passengers' seatbelts while quietly issuing orders to the crew. Jake grew more alert when a strong vibration rippled through the plane, followed by a muffled sound from the cockpit. Through the crack in the cockpit door, he saw the amber light flashing more frequently. He knew enough to recognize it as a serious warning. Suddenly, The plane dropped slightly. Passengers screamed, trays flew, and even Susan gripped the armrest tightly. Jake stayed calm, though his heart was racing. Then Ethan whispered, "Jake, about the masks. Do you think it's connected to this?" Jake blinked, processing Ethan's words. He had read about oxygen system failures and realized that the mask exchange in the cockpit could signal a pressurization issue. Before he could respond, Megan grabbed the intercom. "Passengers, the situation is under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Her voice wavered. Jake could tell she was trying to downplay the seriousness of the problem. He knew he had to act. "I think the pilots are in trouble," Jake said to Ethan. Ethan's eyes widened. "How do you know?" "The cockpit light, and what you said about the masks. It could be a serious oxygen system issue," Jake explained quickly. He knew Megan needed to be informed. Unbuckling his seatbelt, he tried to stand, but the turbulence forced him back into his seat. Determined, he waited for an opportunity and flagged Megan as she walked by. "I need to talk to you. It's about the cockpit," Jake said. Megan stopped, surprised but visibly impatient. "Kid, now's not the time to alarm the passengers." "I'm not trying to alarm anyone. But if the pilots are incapacitated, you need to check," Jake insisted, keeping his tone steady. Megan hesitated. Jake's calm confidence gave her pause. Before she could respond, the plane jolted violently again, and the oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments. Panic erupted in the cabin. Passengers screamed, fumbling to put on their masks. Megan grabbed the radio, desperately trying to reach the cockpit. Jake turned to Ethan, who was frozen with fear. "Take a deep breath. We've got this." Seeing no response from the cockpit, Megan finally relented. "All right, kid, come with me." Jake stood, his heart pounding. He knew this was serious. As he followed Megan toward the cockpit, he realized this flight would be unlike any simulation he had ever studied. Megan cautiously opened the cockpit door. Jake followed close behind, feeling the warm, heavy air hit him. Inside, both pilots were slumped over the control panels, their heads resting limply on the instruments. Oxygen masks were strapped to their faces, but something was clearly wrong. "My God," Megan whispered, assessing the grim scene. Jake scanned the cockpit, taking in the situation quickly. The blinking lights on the control panel caught his attention. The autopilot was engaged, but the plane was starting to wobble. Without manual control, it was losing stability. "They're unresponsive," Megan exclaimed, shaking Captain Roberts' shoulder. Jake, doing his best to stay calm, focused on the instruments. He pointed to a warning light on the panel. "That's an oxygen system failure. Something's wrong with the air they're breathing." Megan turned to him, her expression a mix of disbelief and desperation. "How do you know that?" "I study planes. I've read about this kind of issue," Jake explained, his mind racing. "If the pressurization system failed, the air they're breathing might be contaminated." Before they could formulate a plan, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear. "Jake!" he called, still out of breath. "Remember what I said earlier about the weird smell in the cabin?" Jake turned to his cousin, trying to piece it together. "What exactly did you see, Ethan?" "I was on my way to the bathroom and saw them swapping out the oxygen masks. One of the pilots said something about the air being different. I thought it was just a bad smell, but..." Ethan's voice trailed off as he swallowed hard. The realization hit Jake like a lightning bolt. That makes sense. If the main oxygen system is compromised, they might have inhaled something toxic. Megan's gaze darted between the two boys, torn between skepticism and the urgency to act. Finally, she grabbed the radio and tried once more to contact air traffic control, but static was the only response. "We don't have time to wait for help. What can we do?" she asked, her eyes locked on Jake. Jake took a deep breath. He knew the wrong move could endanger everyone on board, but doing nothing wasn't an option. First, we need to stabilize the plane. The autopilot's on, but without manual adjustments, we could veer off course, Jake said, pointing at the control panel. Megan hesitated. Do you know how to do that? I've done it in simulators, but never on a real plane, Jake admitted. We don't have a choice, Megan replied, stepping up to assist. Following Jake's instructions, she adjusted the controls as he monitored the altitude and speed indicators. The turbulence still rattled the plane, but they managed to reduce the violent movements. What about the pilots? Ethan asked, his eyes fixed on the unconscious men. Jake paused, considering the gravity of the situation. We need to ventilate their cabin somehow. If we don't, they won't wake up. Megan nodded, glancing at the oxygen system. But Jake knew this problem required tools and time they didn't have at the moment. Suddenly, another warning light began to flash. Jake stared at the panel, a chill running down his spine. The hydraulic system is failing, he murmured. What does that mean? Megan asked, her voice tight with anxiety. It means that if we don't fix this soon, we'll lose control of the plane, Jake explained, his tone serious but steady. As Jake studied the instruments and Megan worked to maintain order in the cabin, Ethan stood by, visibly scared but determined to help. Jake, what can I do? The younger boy asked. Jake looked at him, surprised by his courage, and offered a small smile. Stay with me and keep an eye on everything. You can be my eyes while I handle the controls. Ethan nodded, relieved to have a task. As the plane pushed forward through the storm, Jake felt the immense weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had never imagined that his love for aviation would be tested like this. But there was no turning back now. Jake took a deep breath as Megan adjusted the controls under his instructions. The weight of the situation was beginning to settle in. He was now the only person in the cockpit capable of keeping the plane in the air. Outside, the storm roared like a sinister warning, and the turbulence rocked the aircraft relentlessly. It's getting harder to stabilize this thing, Megan said, gripping the controls tightly. Jake frowned, his eyes scanning the instruments. The hydraulic system is failing. It controls the ailerons, the rudder, basically everything that keeps the plane stable. Megan tried to mask her apprehension, but the tension was evident in her voice. So, what do we do? Jake's gaze darted across the panel. He knew he needed to act fast, but the problem was too complex to handle alone. Then he noticed something odd. The hydraulic pressure was dropping faster than it should. He suspected a leak, but had no way of knowing where it was. We need help, Jake said. There might be someone in the cabin with technical knowledge. Megan nodded quickly and left to organize the passengers, leaving Jake temporarily in control of the plane. As she worked, Jake called Ethan to help monitor the instruments. The 9-year-old looked nervous, but his curiosity outweighed his fear. What do you need me to do? Ethan asked, trying to sound confident. Watch this altitude indicator. If it starts dropping quickly, let me know, Jake instructed, pointing to one of the gauges. A few minutes later, Megan returned with a gray-haired man wearing thick glasses and a determined expression. This is Mr. Harris. He's a retired aeronautical engineer, she said, visibly relieved. Harris quickly surveyed the panel and the state of the cockpit. Well, you've got a serious problem here, he said, kneeling beside Jake. The hydraulic system is failing. I think there's a leak, but I don't know where, Jake explained swiftly. Harris nodded, examining the controls. If it's a leak, it's likely in the main line system. We'll need to isolate it before you lose total control. Jake listened intently. He knew the basics of hydraulic systems, but this was a situation unlike anything he'd encountered. Harris began explaining how to reroute pressure to secondary systems. We're going to have to toggle some valves. It's risky, but it might buy us some time, Harris said. Following Harris's instructions, Jake carefully adjusted the settings. Each movement caused the plane to jolt slightly, but gradually the controls began responding better. This will hold for now, But it's not a permanent fix, Harris warned. We need to prepare for a rough landing. Jake nodded, but before he could respond, Megan re-entered the cockpit. We've got another problem. The passengers are getting restless. They want to know what's going on. Jake glanced at her, thinking quickly. Tell them the truth, but stay calm. Explain that we're addressing the issue and working with an expert. Megan hesitated for a moment but nodded and returned to the cabin. The weight of responsibility grew heavier on Jake's shoulders. He knew that one wrong move could cost the lives of everyone on board. Ethan, standing beside him, watched in silence, but with clear admiration. You're doing great, Jake, Ethan said, a rare moment of seriousness in his tone. Jake managed a small smile despite the tension. Thanks. We're going to need all the help we can get. The storm outside seemed to be easing, but the radio still emitted nothing but static. Communication with air traffic control was completely cut off. Even if they managed to stabilize the plane, landing it would be a monumental challenge. Harris adjusted his glasses and looked at Jake. Kid, you've got what it takes. Just follow the instructions and stay calm. We'll get through this. Jake nodded. He knew he had to believe that. But with so many systems failing and no contact with the tower, he couldn't be certain what the next step would bring. The cockpit felt like a war zone. Warning lights flashed, the controls were partially unresponsive, and the relentless roar of the storm outside created an invisible pressure that weighed heavily on Jake's shoulders. He knew their time was running out. Harris pointed at the panel. The secondary hydraulic system is working, but only partially. We need to address this soon, or we'll lose complete control. Jake nodded, doing his best to stay focused. He adjusted the levers as Harris had instructed, redirecting the remaining hydraulic pressure to the critical systems. This should stabilize us for a few more minutes. But what if it completely fails? Harris shrugged. Then you'll be flying with almost no control, just you and the autopilot, if it's still functional. Jake didn't have time to process the grim statement. Megan burst back into the cockpit, her forehead glistening with sweat. The main cabin is getting restless. Some passengers are panicking. I need you to fix this fast. We're doing everything we can, Megan, Harris replied without looking up from the instruments. Jake cut in, his voice firmer than expected. Megan, try to keep everyone occupied. Talk to them, ask them to look after each other, and if there's anyone with emergency experience, get them to help. Megan, clearly impressed by Jake's calm authority, nodded and left. The radio was still silent. Jake tried again. Miami Control, this is Flight 237. We are experiencing multiple failures and require immediate assistance. Repeat, we need immediate assistance. Only static responded. Jake felt a knot tighten in his stomach. They were completely alone. Harris glanced at the radar. The storm is still strong, but it looks like we're approaching its edge. If we can get out of this area, we might be able to re-establish communication. Jake checked the instruments again. The autopilot was still engaged, but the course seemed to be drifting slightly. He frowned, trying to figure out the cause. The autopilot is overloaded. It's trying to correct the flight path, but the hydraulic failure is stopping it, he said, turning to Harris. Can you adjust it manually? Harris asked. Jake hesitated. I can, but it means turning off the autopilot completely. If I make a mistake, there won't be anyone to correct it. You can do this, kid. Let's try, Harris said, his tone encouraging. Jake took a deep breath and disengaged the autopilot. Immediately, the plane gave a small lurch, as if testing the resolve of its new pilot. Jake gripped the controls tightly, feeling the resistance from the faulty systems. Easy, Jake. Small corrections only, Harris guided, keeping an eye on the instruments. Jake concentrated, doing his best to steady the aircraft. The turbulence had eased slightly, but crosswinds still rocked the plane. He glanced at the radar and froze. Is that a hurricane? Jake asked, pointing at a circular formation directly in their path. Harris's eyes widened. Yes, It's a hurricane forming. We need to get out of this path immediately. Jake began adjusting the course manually, but the resistance in the controls made every movement feel like a battle against an unseen force. He looked at Harris for confirmation. Am I heading in the right direction? Harris checked the radar quickly. You are, but you need to move faster. The hurricane is forming faster than expected. Sweat dripped down Jake's face as he fought to redirect the plane. Each adjustment put more strain on his arms and mind. Megan returned to the cockpit, looking even more anxious. Jake, what's happening now? She asked. Hurricane. We're steering clear of its path, Jake replied without taking his eyes off the controls. She turned to Harris. Can we make it? If this kid keeps it up, we have a shot, but it's still dangerous, Harris said. Jake felt the weight of the statement. He couldn't fail. Not with so many lives depending on him. As he adjusted the course, the plane began to clear the worst of the storm. The radar showed they were skirting the hurricane, but it placed them on an unexpected and perilous route. You did it, Jake. We're out of the worst of it, Harris said, offering a rare smile. It's not over yet, Jake replied, already focusing on the next challenge. Although they had avoided the hurricane, the plane was now heading into unknown territory with no communication and systems still unstable. Jake's resolve hardened. This was far from over, but he wasn't about to give up. Though the plane was out of the storm's center, the danger was far from over. Jake glanced at the radar, which showed the hurricane forming rapidly in the opposite direction of their original route. The navigation system was compromised, and with no communication from air traffic control, any mistake could be fatal. Harris worked on the instruments, buying precious time as Jake managed the manual controls. Megan entered the cockpit again, tension etched across her face. Jake, the passengers are asking questions. They know something's wrong. Tell them the truth, Jake replied, without taking his eyes off the controls. Explain we've had system failures, but are doing everything to get them to safety. Megan nodded and left to reassure the cabin. Harris pointed at the radar beside him. Look, kid, we're a safe distance from the hurricane, but we need to correct our altitude. These downdrafts could push us straight into the ocean. Jake nodded grimly. He adjusted the controls, pulling back on the yoke with all his strength as the engines roared in protest. The resistance was so intense, it felt like trying to move a mountain. It's responding, but barely, Jake said, his arms trembling with the effort. Keep going. You're in control now, Harris encouraged, though concern was clear in his eyes. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Megan did her best to calm the passengers. Some were crying, others tried to comfort those in panic. Ethan, unable to sit still, decided to return to the cockpit, both curious and worried. Jake, how's it going? Ethan asked, breathing heavily. Jake spared a quick glance at his cousin. We're getting out of the worst of it, but the controls are still giving us trouble. Ethan stepped closer, watching the instruments with interest. Remember when I told you about the weird smell in the cabin? What if that's also affecting other parts of the plane? Jake froze for a moment, the implication dawning on him. He turned to Harris, who seemed to consider the idea. The pressurization system, it could be connected to the hydraulic issue. If there's a leak of contaminated air, it might have caused corrosion in the main systems, Harris said thoughtfully. That means the plane is more damaged than we realized, Jake concluded, the weight of the situation pressing harder on his mind. Just then, the radar emitted a warning. Harris glanced at it and cursed under his breath. Updrafts. We're about to get thrown upward. Before they could react, a violent updraft launched the plane skyward. Passengers screamed, and Megan clung to a seat to keep from falling. Jake gripped the yoke tightly, fighting to stabilize the aircraft. Cut engine power, Harris yelled. Jake reached for the throttles, reducing the engine's power. Gradually, the plane started to level out, but the tension in the cockpit was thick enough to cut with a knife. That was too close, Harris said, exhaling deeply. These currents are deadly, but we're nearing calmer skies. Jake scanned the panel again. We're burning more fuel than expected. The longer we stay airborne, the harder it'll be to reach Miami. Harris nodded, studying the radar. We're going to need an alternate route. Without communication, you'll have to decide where to go. Jake felt the burden of responsibility settle heavily on him again. He knew one wrong choice could endanger everyone on board. Looking at the radar, he spotted an opening between the hurricane and their original route. We'll take this path. If we keep the altitude stable and adjust the course here, we can avoid the worst, Jake said, pointing at the screen. Harris analyzed the plan quickly and nodded. Looks solid. Let's do it. As they adjusted the route, Megan re-entered the cockpit. How are we doing? Skirting the hurricane, Harris replied, but we still have to land with critical system failures. Megan nodded, her worried expression unwavering. The passengers need a happy ending to this. Jake turned to her, his determination evident. They'll get one. The plane continued on its new course, but everyone knew the greatest challenge lay ahead, landing in Miami with compromised systems, unclear runway conditions, and an unconfirmed landing gear. The Boeing 737-800 cut through the calmer skies, finally clear of the storm's worst wrath. Jake felt a fleeting sense of relief as the radar displayed open air ahead, but the real test loomed. Landing the plane with damaged hydraulic systems and an unconfirmed landing gear was the ultimate challenge. Harris studied the instruments and frowned. Jake, the main landing gear system isn't responding. If we can't deploy it manually, this plane is belly landing. Jake's throat tightened. He understood the gravity of the situation. A belly landing could put everyone on board in grave danger. Turning to Harris, he asked, "There's a manual override for the landing gear, right?" Harris nodded. "Yes, but it's tricky. There's an emergency crank that releases the landing gear by gravity. The problem is, with the hydraulic failure, it might not deploy fully." Jake took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. "Then we'll make it work. We don't have another option." Megan appeared in the cockpit doorway, her face worn with exhaustion. "The passengers are panicking. They need reassurance." Jake met her gaze, his tone steady. "Tell them we're preparing for a safe landing. Ask them to follow your instructions when the time comes." Megan hesitated, then nodded, Jake's firm resolve giving her confidence. She left to organize the cabin as Jake and Harris strategized their next move. "I'll head to the maintenance bay where the manual crank is," Harris said, standing up. "But I'll need help." Jake turned to Ethan, who had been watching everything intently. "Ethan, can you help Mr. Harris?" Ethan's eyes widened in surprise, but quickly nodded. "What do I need to do?" "Just follow his instructions and move fast," Jake said, masking his own anxiety. Harris and Ethan left the cockpit, leaving Jake alone with the controls. He adjusted the altitude and speed for their approach to Miami, though the radio remained silent. With no communication from the tower, Jake had to rely solely on his eyes and the radar to align the plane with the runway. In the maintenance bay, Harris pointed to a large, rusted lever. "This is it. We need to crank it hard enough to release the landing gear." Ethan grabbed the lever alongside Harris, both of them straining to move it. The metal groaned loudly but didn't budge. "It's stuck!" Ethan exclaimed, his small arms shaking with the effort. Harris clenched his jaw. "We're not giving up. Keep trying." Back in the cockpit, Jake noticed the plane starting to lose stability. The remaining hydraulic systems were failing fast, and he needed answers. Grabbing the intercom, he called out, "Harris, what's your status?" "We're still working on it. 1 more minute," Harris replied. Jake gripped the controls tightly, sweat dripping down his face. The Miami coastline came into view, a comforting sight that also brought an intense wave of pressure. In the maintenance bay, Ethan spotted a solution. "What if we use this metal bar as a lever?" he suggested, pointing to a nearby tool. Harris's face lit up with approval. "Great idea, kid. Let's try it." They wedged the bar into the lever and cranked again. Slowly, the groaning intensified until the lever finally gave way. A heavy clunk echoed through the plane. Jake heard it through the intercom. "Did you get it?" "The landing gear is deploying," Harris shouted back. Jake checked the indicators on his panel. 2 of the 3 landing gear components were confirmed. His stomach dropped. "One still stuck." Harris examined the 3rd gear. It was partially deployed but jammed in place. "This one's going to need more force. We're running out of time," Harris yelled to Ethan. In the cockpit, Jake began their final approach. The Miami runway was now visible, but crosswinds buffeted the plane. Landing with only 2 confirmed landing gear pieces would be treacherous. Megan returned to the cockpit, her face calm but determined. "Jake, we're ready back here. Just tell us what to do." Jake nodded. "When I give the signal, have everyone lean to the right. It might help reduce the impact." Megan left to relay the instructions, and Jake activated the intercom again. "Harris, what's the status on that last gear?" "It's stuck, but we're almost there," Harris shouted. Jake glanced at the panel, then back at the runway, quickly approaching. "We have less than 2 minutes." The Boeing 737-800 was in its final descent. Jake gripped the controls tightly, adjusting altitude and speed as the plane battled increasingly fierce crosswinds. The lights of Miami's runway glimmered ahead, but the 3rd landing gear was still stuck. Time was running out, and the looming impact felt more real with every passing second. In the maintenance bay, Harris and Ethan continued their struggle to release the landing gear manually. The sound of groaning metal accompanied their frantic efforts. "Push harder, Ethan! We're almost there!" Harris shouted, sweat dripping as he applied all his strength to the crank. Ethan, small but determined, leaned his full weight onto the metal bar for extra leverage. A sudden, sharp click echoed in the compartment. "Did it work?" Harris asked. The heavy thud of the landing gear deploying and locking into place answered him. Harris grabbed the intercom. "Jake, it's done. The landing gear is deployed." In the cockpit, Jake checked the indicators. All 3 landing gear showed green. He exhaled in relief. "Great work! Get back to your seats and brace yourselves. We're landing now." Harris and Ethan rushed back to the main cabin. Ethan looked exhausted, but beamed with pride as he took his seat next to his mother. Megan was moving quickly down the aisle, shouting instructions to keep the passengers calm. "Everyone lean to the right when I give the signal. Stay buckled and follow my instructions," she called out, her voice steady despite the tension. Jake adjusted the flaps to reduce speed. The crosswinds remained a significant challenge, but with the landing gear operational, the odds were better. "Harris, anything else to check before touchdown?" Jake asked over the intercom. Harris's voice came through quickly. "The hydraulic system is still weak. The brakes might fail. Use the engine thrust reversers as soon as you touch down." Jake nodded, mentally preparing for the sequence. As the runway approached rapidly, he focused all his energy on a steady descent. "All right, this is it," he muttered to himself. In the final seconds, Jake made delicate adjustments to the controls, angling the nose for a smooth touchdown. The front landing gear hit the runway first, followed by the rear wheels. The impact was jarring, but controlled. "Thrust reversers!" Jake shouted, engaging the mechanisms that reversed engine thrust to slow the plane. The Boeing screeched as it skidded down the runway. As Harris had predicted, the hydraulic brakes only partially responded. Jake used the thrust reversers and ailerons to keep the plane steady, battling the crosswinds. In the cabin, passengers leaned right as instructed, gripping their seats tightly. Megan's voice rang out, urging calm, while the plane gradually decelerated. After what felt like an eternity, the aircraft finally slowed to a complete stop in the middle of the runway. A profound silence filled the cabin before it was broken by applause and relieved cheers from the passengers. Jake released the controls and leaned back, taking a deep breath. Megan entered the cockpit, tears in her eyes. "You did it, Jake. You actually did it." Jake gave her a tired but grateful smile. It was a team effort. Harris appeared moments later, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. "Kid, you did an amazing job." Harris said. Ethan grinned proudly at his cousin. And you said I didn't know anything about planes. Jake laughed, the tension finally easing from his body for the first time in hours, but he knew the ordeal wasn't entirely over. Emergency crews needed to assess the damage, and the unconscious pilot still required medical attention. The sound of sirens filled the air as emergency vehicles sped onto the runway. Passengers were carefully evacuated from the plane under Megan's direction, filing down the inflatable slides to safety. Jake stayed in the cockpit, watching the scene unfold, feeling both relief and an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. Despite the impossible odds, he had done it. The plane stood motionless in the middle of the runway, surrounded by the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. Jake remained seated in the cockpit for a few moments, his hands still trembling as they gripped the controls. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. Megan stepped into the cockpit again, her face lit with relief. The emergency team is helping the passengers. You saved everyone, Jake. Jake looked at her, drained but focused. What about the pilots? Megan gestured toward the medical crew boarding the plane. They're taking care of them now. It looks like they'll be fine, but they're still unconscious. Jake nodded, finally allowing himself to relax. Harris and Ethan appeared at the door, both looking visibly relieved. Harris patted Jake on the shoulder. Kid, you did what most adults wouldn't even dare to try. That was incredible work. Ethan, still brimming with energy, crossed his arms with a playful grin. You're a hero, cousin, and I helped, so that makes us a team. Jake let out a short but genuine laugh. Yeah, a pretty good team. As the passengers were evacuated onto emergency buses, Jake, Harris, Megan and Ethan stayed on board to assist with the final procedures. Maintenance technicians and paramedics moved quickly, assessing the plane's condition and attending to passengers who needed medical attention. One of the paramedics approached Jake. Are you the one who took control of the plane? Jake hesitated but nodded. I just did what I knew. She smiled warmly, clearly impressed. What you knew saved a lot of lives today. Don't underestimate that. Jake didn't respond, gazing out of the cockpit window. The runway lights sparkled against the dark night, and he could see passengers being escorted to the terminal, many still shaken but safe. Harris approached again, this time holding a radio handed to him by a technician. I managed to restore communication with the control tower. They want to speak with you, Jake. Jake stared at the radio in surprise. With me? Yes, you, Harris said with a grin. You're the pilot now, remember? Jake hesitantly took the radio, adjusting the frequency nervously. This is Flight 237. All passengers are safe. The response came almost instantly. This is Miami Tower. You did an incredible job, Jake. We've been briefed on what happened aboard, and the emergency services are here to assist further. Jake muttered a quiet thank you before handing the radio back to Harris. As the plane was emptied and inspected, Jake stepped out of the cockpit into the now empty cabin. Ethan followed closely behind, the same proud smile on his face. You're going to be famous, Jake. Everyone's going to talk about this, Ethan said. Jake shook his head. It wasn't about being famous, it was about making sure everyone was okay. Ethan shrugged. Still, you deserve it. Finally, Jake and his family were escorted off the plane, greeted by applause from the emergency crew and passengers already on the ground. Jake blushed at the attention, but accepted the gratitude with a shy smile. As they made their way toward the terminal, Harris placed a hand on Jake's shoulder one last time. Never stop learning, kid. The world needs more people like you. Jake looked up at him, feeling a new sense of determination welling inside. I won't stop. I'm going to keep studying. I want to be ready for this for real someday. With that, they walked into the brightly lit terminal, leaving behind the darkened plane, its lights slowly dimming as it rested on the runway. A quiet monument to an unforgettable journey. A few days had passed since the landing of Flight 237, but the impact of what had happened still resonated everywhere. Jake Turner had unwittingly become a central figure in news headlines and social media. His bravery and unexpected knowledge in a life-or-death situation had inspired millions around the world. For Jake, though, life seemed to have returned to normal. He was back home in his small town, sitting at his desk, revisiting the flight simulators he loved so much. But something had changed. Every maneuver he practiced now felt more real, more significant. "Jake, come here," his mum called from the living room. Jake turned off the simulator and headed downstairs. His family was gathered around the TV, where a news anchor was speaking about him. The 13-year-old, who saved more than 200 lives, is now being hailed as a national hero. Experts say his aviation skills, combined with his calm under pressure, were critical in averting a tragedy. Jake rolled his eyes and tried to slip away quietly, but his Aunt Susan stopped him. "Not so fast, hero. You're going to hear this." Before he could protest, the doorbell rang. Susan opened the door to reveal a tall man in a pristine pilot's uniform. He smiled as he saw Jake. "You must be Jake Turner. I'm Captain Roberts," he said, extending a hand. Jake's jaw dropped. You're okay?" The captain nodded, laughing. "I am. Thanks to you. We need to talk, son." They sat in the kitchen while Susan poured coffee and Ethan peeked around the corner, trying to listen in. "Jake, what you did on that plane was extraordinary. I've been a pilot for decades, and I've never seen someone so young demonstrate such skill and composure in an extreme situation." Jake blushed, fiddling with the corner of the table. "I just did what I knew." "And that saved lives," Roberts interrupted. "Many seasoned pilots wouldn't have managed what you did. You have a bright future in aviation if you choose to pursue it." Jake looked up at him, surprised. "You think I could be a pilot?" The captain chuckled. "I think you've already started." In the days that followed, Jake's story continued to capture public attention. He was invited to TV shows, interviews, and even received a thank you letter from the airline's management. But what truly touched him were the messages and gifts from the passengers of Flight 237. They sent letters, photos of their families, and heartfelt thanks for saving their lives. One evening, as Jake read through the letters, he found a note from Harris. "Jake, you didn't just save all of us. You reminded me why I chose aviation as a career. If you ever need advice or help to follow this path, I'm here. You're special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jake held the letter with a determined smile. He knew that what had happened on Flight 237 was just the beginning. Months later, Jake was invited to visit a pilot training center. There, he got to see the professional simulators used to train commercial pilots. As he stepped into the cockpit of one, a chill of recognition ran through him. This time, he wasn't just a curious kid playing with a home simulator. He was someone who knew he could one day fly for real. Sitting at the controls, Jake listened to the instructor's guidance and began the simulated training. Every maneuver, every decision felt like a reflection of the real-life experience he had lived. At the end of the session, the instructor looked at him, clearly impressed. "You've got talent, Jake. Keep this up and you're going to be one of the best." Jake smiled, gazing out the simulator's window at the endless blue sky. He felt the pull again, but this time it wasn't just a dream. It was destiny. And so ends the incredible journey of Jake Turner, the boy who proved that knowledge and courage can save lives. So what did you think of this tension-filled, inspiring story? If you were in Jake's shoes, do you think you could stay calm in such an extreme situation? Comment below and let us know what you would have done differently in his place. If you enjoyed this adventure, don't forget to leave a like to support the channel and help us bring more stories like this. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos full of emotion and twists. Here's a special question for you. What was the most memorable moment in this story for you? Was it Jake taking control of the plane, Harris guiding the repairs, or maybe Ethan proving that even small details can save the day? I'd love to know what kept you hooked in this narrative. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the courage you need is already within you, just waiting to be discovered. See you in the next video.